She looked at his face and stepped back. Not one word, not one greeting, just that single instinctive step backward, and the sound of the wedding ring box snapping shut in his scarred hand. The whole platform heard it. Samuel Hayes stood in the middle of Pine Hollow Station, the morning sun cutting across the ruin of his face, and he didn't flinch. He had expected this. He had always expected this. But Elizabeth Carter hadn't expected to become the woman who caused it. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a comment telling us what city you're watching from, and stay with us until the very last word. You won't want to miss what happens next. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday. Elizabeth Carter remembered that detail with strange precision, the way the morning light fell across the kitchen table, the way her mother's cough carried through the thin walls from the back room, the way her hands trembled slightly when she broke the seal on the envelope because she had been waiting 3 weeks for it and was terrified of what it might say. The letter was from a man named Samuel Hayes. It was the 4th letter he had written her, the 4th in 3 months. And like the 3 before it, it said almost nothing about himself, in the way men usually said things about themselves. He didn't describe his height, his property, his income, or his ambitions in terms of land or cattle or social standing. He didn't ask about her appearance. He didn't inquire about the exact acreage of the ranch or what the soil was good for, or whether there was water access on the eastern boundary. He wrote about a house he had rebuilt after a family lost theirs in a flood. He wrote about the satisfaction of setting the last beam and watching children run back through their own front door. He wrote about the sound a good piece of wood makes when it's cut true. A clean, honest sound, he called it, and how he believed buildings carried the character of the people who made them. He wrote about wanting more than anything a life that was quiet and purposeful. He wrote, "I am not a man of many words in person, but I find I have a great deal to say to you, and I am not entirely sure why. Perhaps it is because your letters feel honest, and honesty has become rare enough that I notice it." Elizabeth had read that line 4 times the first morning. She had told herself it was only because the phrasing was unusual, not because it reached something inside her. She had kept carefully closed since her father died, and left her standing in the middle of a failing ranch with 60 head of cattle going thin, a mother coughing blood into a handkerchief, a mortgage that had been quietly growing for 2 years, and a town full of men waiting to see how long she'd last before she surrendered the land. She had lasted 14 months. 14 months of waking before dawn and working until her hands bled. 14 months of selling she couldn't afford to sell and buying feed she couldn't afford to buy, and smiling at the banker's questions and telling him she was managing fine. 14 months of watching her younger brother Thomas try to carry a man's work on a 12-year-old's body, his small shoulders going tight with effort he was too proud to admit was too much for him. And 14 months of men in town suggesting with increasing confidence that she ought to consider marriage. Not suggesting it gently. Suggesting it the way men suggest things when they believe they already know the answer and are simply waiting for you to catch up. Richard Caldwell had suggested it 3 times in those 14 months. Richard Caldwell owned the largest ranch in Pine Hollow County. He was 44 years old, thick through the chest, expensive in his dress, and precise in the way he spoke. The kind of precise that meant he had spent a great deal of time learning how to sound reasonable while saying unreasonable things. He had a smile that arrived slightly before it was warranted and stayed slightly longer than it should have. He had offered to buy her father's land twice before the man was even cold in the ground. He had done it politely both times, which somehow made it worse. When she turned him down, he shifted his approach. He began suggesting that marriage was the sensible option for a woman in her position. He framed it as concern. He said things like, "I only want to see you protected, and your father would have wanted someone to look after you, and the land is too much for one person." Elizabeth, and we both know it. He never said his own name when he said these things. He didn't have to. The offer was always implied, and it was always attached to the land. Elizabeth had understood from the first week what Richard Caldwell actually wanted. He didn't want her. He wanted the eastern creek bed and the mineral rights her father had quietly secured 15 years ago, and the water access that connected 2 otherwise landlocked properties. He wanted it badly enough to be patient about it, and patient men with money had a way of eventually getting what they wanted in small Colorado towns. So Elizabeth had written the advertisement herself. She had sat at the kitchen table on a cold February night, her mother asleep in the back room, Thomas gone to bed with his school books, and she had written, "Colorado woman 24. Operating working ranch, seeks correspondence with man of honest character who values partnership over possession. Knowledge of land work preferred. Letters only to begin." She had not described herself. She had not mentioned beauty or domestic skill, or any of the things women were supposed to mention. She had not mentioned the mortgage or her mother's health, or the fact that the roof of the main barn was one hard winter away from giving up entirely. She had sent the advertisement to a Wyoming paper because she wanted someone who didn't know Pine Hollow, someone who would come without preconceptions. 11 men had written back. 9 of them had asked within the first letter either what she looked like or exactly how much land was involved. She had written back to none of them. Samuel Hayes had not asked either question. She had written back to him. By the 4th letter, she had begun to build a picture of him the way the mind inevitably does when it has words, but no face to attach them to. She pictured someone lean and quiet. Someone whose hands were rough, but whose voice was even. Someone with lines around his eyes from working outdoors, and a kind of steadiness that came from having survived something without being defeated by it. She had not realized how clearly she had drawn that picture until the morning train pulled into Pine Hollow Station and a man stepped onto the platform who matched none of it. How was tall. That part was accurate. Broad through the shoulders, in a way that suggested not just labor, but something older than labor, the kind of physical density that comes from having been tested. He moved deliberately with a stillness about him that was not quite ease, not quite tension, but something between the two. He carried a single leather bag and wore a dark coat that had been good quality once years ago and was still maintained with careful respect for that former quality. And then he turned toward the station, and Elizabeth saw his face. The scar began at his left temple and ran in a long diagonal across his cheekbone, pulling the skin tight along that side of his jaw. A second mark, shorter and deeper, crossed his chin. His left hand, where it held the bag, was textured with old burn scarring that had healed into ridged, discolored skin across the back of his knuckles and down toward the wrist. The platform was not crowded. It was a Tuesday morning. But there were enough people, the station master, 2 men loading freight, a woman with a child waiting for a different passenger, that the silence when it fell was audible. Not complete silence. Murmuring. The particular murmuring of people deciding something without evidence. Elizabeth was standing 15 feet from the platform steps. She had told herself during the 2-day wait between Samuel's final letter confirming his arrival and this moment that she would be composed, that she would assess him fairly, that she was a practical woman making a practical arrangement, and she would conduct herself accordingly. She stepped backward, 1 step, involuntary. Her body made the decision before her mind finished forming it, and she heard her own boot shift on the packed earth and felt the small shock of recognizing what she had just done. Samuel had been watching her since the moment he stepped off the train. She understood that now. He had identified her immediately, perhaps, from some description she had given in her letters, or perhaps simply because she was the only woman standing alone on that platform with the particular expression of someone who has been waiting and is now confronted with the consequences of having waited. He saw her step back. She watched his face for a reaction and saw something that was worse than anger. She saw recognition. The practiced, settled recognition of a man who has had this experience before and has learned to absorb it without visible damage. He reached into his coat pocket and removed a small box. Dark wood hinged, the kind of box that held a ring. He held it in his scarred hand for a moment, looking at it rather than at her. Then he closed his fingers around it. "I understand," he said. His voice was low, and even the kind of voice that had been trained by years of saying necessary things quietly. "You expected someone different." He didn't say it as an accusation. He said it the way a man states a fact he has already accepted, which was somehow far more difficult to hear than an accusation would have been. Elizabeth opened her mouth. Something moved in her chest that was not quite guilt and not quite shame, but was made of both in approximately equal measure. She said, "Mr. Hayes." You don't owe me an explanation." He tucked the box back into his coat. "You were honest in your letters. That matters. I don't hold the rest against you." He picked up his bag, and Elizabeth Carter, who had spent 14 months refusing to be the woman Pine Hollow expected her to be, stood completely still and let a good man walk past her. The murmuring on the platform shifted register. She heard it behind her as she stood there, the satisfied sound of a town that had been given exactly the kind of story it preferred to tell about people who made unexpected choices. She heard Nora Whitfield, the banker's wife, say something to her companion. She didn't catch all of it. She caught enough. Well, what did she expect advertising like that? Elizabeth turned around. Samuel had stopped at the edge of the platform. He was speaking to the station master, apparently asking about lodging in town. The station master, a florid man named Gerald Pruitt, who collected other people's business, the way some men collected coins, was answering with the particular helpfulness of someone planning to tell the story later. Thomas appeared at Elizabeth's elbow. Her brother had been standing back slightly behind her, which was a habit he had developed in the months since their father died, positioning himself where he could watch without being the center of anything. He was 12 and tall for his age, and deeply serious in the way children become serious when they've been present for too many adult difficulties. He watched Samuel Hayes cross the platform. "That's him," Thomas said. "Yes." "He doesn't look like I thought." "No," Elizabeth said. "He doesn't." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He looks like he's been in a fire." "Thomas, I'm not saying it wrong. I'm just saying what it looks like." Elizabeth looked at her brother. He wasn't being cruel. He was 12 years old, and he was making an observation with the directness that children retain until the world teaches them to be more careful with the truth. "His letters were kind," Thomas said. "I know. You read them to me. They were kind letters." "I know," Elizabeth said again. She watched Samuel disappear into the station house with his bag and the station master's directions, and she felt something settle over her that was not peace and was not resolution, but was the particular weight of having done something she could not immediately correct and would have to carry for a while before she understood what to do about it. She went home. She told herself she needed to feed the cattle. She told herself there was a section of fence on the northern pasture that Thomas had reported leaning badly. She told herself there was a list of practical tasks that constituted her life, and that life required attention regardless of the events of a Tuesday morning on a train platform. She fed the cattle. She looked at the fence. She stood in the middle of the north pasture for 11 minutes, doing nothing at all, while the wind moved through the dry summer grass. Then she went back to the house and sat at the kitchen table where she had written the advertisement in February. And she put her hands flat on the surface, and she thought about the look on Samuel Hayes's face when he closed the ring box. Not the scars. The look. The practiced acceptance. The way a man looks when he has been rejected so many times that each new rejection arrives not as a wound, but as a confirmation, as proof of something he had already long believed about himself. She had put that look on his face, within 30 seconds of seeing him, before he had spoken a word, before she had given him the chance to be any of the things his letters had told her he was. Her mother called from the back room. Elizabeth went to her. Margaret Carter was 51 years old and had been healthy and formidable until 2 years ago, when a persistent cough had settled into her chest and refused to leave. The doctor in Pine Hollow had a name for what she had, and Elizabeth had stopped saying the name aloud because saying it made it heavier. "How was he?" her mother asked. Margaret had known about the advertisement. She had not objected to it. She had in fact been the one to say quietly and without drama that Elizabeth could not run the ranch alone forever, and that there was no shame in making a practical arrangement so long as both parties were honest about the nature of it. "He was—" Elizabeth stopped. "Elizabeth." "He's staying in town," she said. "A storm is coming. The road north is likely to be closed for a few days." Her mother looked at her for a long moment. "That's not what I asked," Margaret said. "I know." "What happened?" Elizabeth told her. She told it plainly, without embellishment or excuse, the way she had always told her mother things, even the things that made her look smaller than she wanted to be. She told her about the platform and the step backward, and the ring box, and the sound of his voice saying, "I understand," with that terrible practiced evenness. When she finished, her mother was quiet for a moment. "He sounds," Margaret said finally, like a man who has been told a great many times that his face is the whole story. "Yes. And you told him again." "I didn't mean to." "I know you didn't, but you did." Elizabeth nodded. "What are you going to do about it?" her mother asked. "I don't know yet." "Elizabeth." "I don't know, Mama. I'm trying to work it out." Her mother settled back against her pillows. She had a particular expression she used when she was deciding not to say the rest of what she was thinking. A slight compression of the lips, a deliberate shift of her attention toward the window. She used it now. Elizabeth left her to rest. The storm Gerald Pruitt had been speculating about for 2 days hit that night. It was not a devastating storm, not the kind that took roofs or flooded creek beds, but it was sustained and wind-driven, and by morning the road north out of Pine Hollow was a mud channel that no wagon would navigate without losing a wheel. The road would be passable again in 3 days if the weather held, and possibly 5 if it didn't. Samuel Hayes was staying at Pruitt's boarding house on the main street, which meant he was staying in the only building in Pine Hollow that was guaranteed to generate the maximum possible amount of conversation about him. By the end of the first day, Elizabeth had heard 4 separate stories about him. In one version, his scars came from a knife fight in a Wyoming saloon, the details of which grew more elaborate each time the story was retold. In another version, he had been marked in a mining accident that had also killed 2 other men who were depending on who was telling the story, either his partners or his victims. The third version was the most creative. It involved a dispute over a woman and a rival with a grudge and a fire that may or may not have been deliberate. The fourth version simply said, he was a dangerous man, and anyone who had eyes could see it. Not one version mentioned the letter he had written about the children and the burning house. Elizabeth heard these stories in the feed store, and at the dry goods counter, and through the window of the post office, and she listened to all of them with a flat expression that gave nothing away, because she had learned that expression in the months after her father died, and it had become one of her most useful tools. On the second morning, she went to Pruitt's boarding house. She told herself she was going to apologize. She told herself it was the decent thing to do, and that she was a decent person, and that decent people acknowledged when they had behaved badly. She rehearsed what she would say during the 15-minute walk into town, adjusting the words with each block until she had a version she thought was honest without being excessive. Gerald Pruitt answered the door with an expression of undisguised interest. "Mr. Hayes," Elizabeth said. "Is he in?" "Breakfast room," Pruitt said, stepping aside with a gesture that managed to be simultaneously welcoming and proprietary. "He's been up since 5. Helped me fix a chair that's been broken for 3 months. He paused. "Fixed it properly, too. Didn't just hammer it. Took it apart and put it back right." Elizabeth walked through to the breakfast room. Samuel was sitting alone at the far table, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, reading a newspaper with the focused attention of someone who prefers words on a page to conversations in a room. He was wearing a plain work shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and the burn scarring on his hands and forearms was fully visible in the morning light. He heard her come in. She saw him register her presence, a slight adjustment of his posture, a deliberate moment of stillness before he lowered the newspaper and looked up. His expression was neutral, not hostile, not warm. Neutral in the way of a man who has decided neutrality is the safest ground to occupy. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Hayes." She stopped 2 feet from the table. "May I sit down?" He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. She put her hands in her lap and looked at him directly, because she had decided during the walk that looking at him directly was the minimum she owed him after what she'd done. "I came to apologize," she said. "You don't need to." "I think I do." "What happened at the station was a natural reaction," he said. He said it without resentment, which was somehow the most difficult thing she had encountered in this entire situation. "I don't take it personally. You should," Elizabeth said. He blinked, slightly. It was the first response she had gotten from him that looked unplanned. "I mean that I behaved badly," she said. "And telling me I don't need to apologize for it it's kind of you, but it lets me off too easily, and I don't think I deserve to be let off easily. Not for that." He was quiet for a moment. "What would you prefer?" he said. "That I tell you it hurt? I'd prefer that you tell me the truth." Something shifted in his expression, not much, but enough that she noticed it. "All right," he said. "It hurt. In the way things hurt when they confirm what you already believed was going to happen." He picked up his coffee cup. "But that's not your fault, Miss Carter. That's the weight of history. You didn't create it." "I added to it," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. "You did." They sat with that for a moment. It was the most honest exchange Elizabeth had had with a man in 14 months, and it had taken approximately 90 seconds, and she wasn't entirely sure what to do with that fact. "The road will be open in a few days," she said. "I know. Where will you go?" "I haven't decided." She looked at her hands in her lap, then back up at him. "I'd like to start over," she said. "If that's something you're willing to consider." "Start over," he said. "We wrote 4 months of letters. I'd like to know if the man who wrote those letters is the man sitting across from me. Because the man who wrote those letters—" She stopped, started again. "I didn't step back from him at that station. I stepped back from your face. And those are two different things, and I'd like the chance to correct the confusion." Samuel Hayes looked at her for a long time, long enough that she felt the seconds of it. "I'll think about it," he said. It wasn't yes, but it wasn't no. And Elizabeth Carter, who had learned in 14 months of running a ranch alone, that the distance between "I'll think about it" and yes was territory you could work with, nodded, stood up, and walked out of the boarding house into the morning. She was almost back to the main street when she heard Thomas behind her. He had apparently been waiting outside, had apparently followed her into town without being told. In that particular way he had of appearing where things were happening. "Well," he said. He said he'd think about it. Thomas fell into step beside her. "That's good," he said. "Is it?" "It's better than no." "You've been spending time listening to adult conversations," Elizabeth said. "I'd like you to stop." "I learn things," Thomas said, unrepentant. Elizabeth looked sideways at her brother. He had their father's jaw and their mother's eyes, and a mind that was processing the world at a speed that occasionally frightened her. "What do you think of him?" she asked. "Honestly." Thomas was quiet for a block. Then he said, "He fixed Pruitt's chair this morning. A Windsor chair with a broken stretcher. Pruitt told Mrs. Whitfield it would have cost $2 at the furniture maker. Mr. Hayes fixed it with a piece of wood he found in the woodpile and a bottle of hide glue he asked Pruitt to buy at the store. Pruitt told me he sat and worked on it for an hour and a half without being asked again without payment." Elizabeth listened. "He didn't do it to impress anyone," Thomas said. "Nobody was watching. I only know because Pruitt told me, and Pruitt told me because he was amazed. He said a man staying 2 or 3 days doesn't fix furniture for the house he's staying in." "Unless," Elizabeth said. "Unless what?" "Unless he's the kind of man who fixes broken things when he finds them," Elizabeth said. "Because it's broken, and leaving broken things broken bothers him." Thomas looked up at her. "Is that what his letter said?" "More or less," Elizabeth said. "Yes." They walked the rest of the way home without talking. That evening a man named Holt Granger came by the ranch. Holt was a neighbor. His property ran along the southern boundary of the Carter land, separated by a creek that had been drying up in the summer months and causing disputes about grazing access. He was 56 years old, and weathered and fundamentally decent in the uncomplicated way of men who have spent their lives doing physical work and don't have the patience for complexity. He sat at Elizabeth's kitchen table and turned his hat in his hands and said, "I wanted to talk to you about Caldwell." "What about him?" "He came by my place today. He's telling people you brought a violent man to town, using the fact that you sent the man away from the station as evidence." Elizabeth put down the cup she was drying. "He's saying I sent him away. He's saying you recognized the danger and made a sensible decision." Holt paused. "He's framing it as concern for the community." "He's framing me," Elizabeth said. "Yes." She sat down. What else? He's also started talking about your mortgage. Holt said it quietly with the discomfort of a man delivering news he'd rather not carry. He's not saying anything specific, he's just mentioning it, in the right company, letting people draw their own conclusions about what it means for the land if you can't keep things together. Elizabeth was quiet. I know it's not my business, Holt said, but I've been your father's neighbor for 20 years, and I don't trust Caldwell, and I think you ought to know what he's saying. Thank you, Holt. Is the man Hayes? Is he actually dangerous? No, Elizabeth said. He's a carpenter from Wyoming who wrote me 4 months of honest letters and got on a train and came here, and I repaid him by stepping back when I saw his face. Holt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That's not like you. No, Elizabeth said, it's not. After Holt left, she sat at the table for a long time. The mortgage Caldwell was referencing was 3 years old. Her father had taken it out to expand the herd. A sound decision at the time. A catastrophic one, when the dry summer of that year killed 40% of the grazing grass and prices collapsed, and her father's health went with them. The banker, a careful man named Aldrich, had been patient. He had restructured twice. But patience was not infinite, and Elizabeth knew with the precision of someone who had been doing the arithmetic every week for 14 months that she had approximately 8 months before the patience ran out and the property question became urgent. Caldwell knew it too. She went to the window. The storm had passed and the night was clear and cold with the particular clarity that high Colorado altitude produced, a darkness full of stars, every edge sharp. She thought about the ring box closing in Samuel Hayes's hand. She thought about what it meant that Caldwell was already moving. She thought about the mortgage and the fence, and her mother's cough, and Thomas's too serious face, and the 8 months of runway she had before everything she had worked for became someone else's property. And she thought about a man alone in a boarding house on the main street, reading a newspaper with burn scars on his hands from a fire she didn't yet know the story of. She went to bed. She lay in the dark for a long time. Then she got up and sat at the kitchen table and wrote him a note. Not an apology. She'd done that. Not a proposition. It was too soon and too complicated for that. She wrote, I think there is more to your story than I know. And I think there is more to my situation than I told you in my letters. If you're willing, I'd like us to tell each other the rest of it. Breakfast at the ranch tomorrow morning if you're agreeable. Thomas makes good coffee. She folded it. She would give it to Thomas to deliver in the morning. She went back to bed, and for the first time in 14 months, she slept without dreaming about the mortgage. Thomas delivered the note at 7 in the morning, which meant he had gotten up at 6, which meant he had set his own alarm and dressed himself and walked into town before Elizabeth was fully awake. A fact she discovered when she came into the kitchen to find him already gone, and a piece of paper on the table in his handwriting that said, simply, went to Pruitt's. Back before breakfast. She stood in the kitchen in her boots and her work coat and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, which was the particular warmth of being anticipated. Samuel arrived at 8:15. He came on foot, which meant he had walked the 1.5 miles from town on a road that was still soft from the storm, and his boots were muddy to the ankle, and he didn't apologize for it or comment on it. He knocked at the door with the particular knock of a man who isn't sure of his welcome, but has decided to come anyway. Thomas opened the door before Elizabeth could get there. Mr. Hayes, Thomas said with the gravity of a boy conducting official business. Come in, coffee's ready. Samuel looked down at the boy. Something in his expression shifted just slightly, the way a held thing relaxes when the pressure on it eases. Thank you, he said. Thomas, is it? Yes, sir. Your sister mentioned you in her letters. Thomas stepped back to let him in and shot a look at Elizabeth over Samuel's shoulder, a look that said, he read the letters carefully. Elizabeth gave her brother the expression that meant, don't make something of it. They sat at the kitchen table. Elizabeth poured coffee. Samuel wrapped both hands around the cup the way he had at Pruitt's boarding house, and she noticed again the texture of the burn scars across his knuckles, and tried this time not to let her eyes stop there. I got your note, he said. I know. You said there was more to your situation than you told me. Yes. Then tell me. Elizabeth set down the coffee pot. She had rehearsed this, the same way she'd rehearsed the apology, a careful arrangement of facts in the order that made the most sense, the practical architecture of disclosure. And then she looked at him sitting at her father's table in the morning light, and she abandoned the rehearsed version entirely. She told him everything. The mortgage, the 8 months, Caldwell and his 3 offers, and what was underneath each one of them. Her mother's illness, and what it cost, and what it was going to keep costing. The cattle she'd sold below value, because she needed the cash, and the feed she'd bought above value, because the supplier knew she couldn't go anywhere else. The fence sections that needed replacing, and the barn roof, and the well on the east pasture that was dropping 6 inches a year. She told him without apology or performance. She told him the way she'd told her mother plainly, because embellishment costs energy she didn't have. When she finished, Samuel was quiet for a moment. "You wrote me 4 months of letters," he said, "and you left all of that out." "I left it out because I didn't want a man to come here and think the arrangement was about rescuing me," she said. "I wanted to know who he was before I showed him what he was walking into. And now you're showing me. Now I'm showing you." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Why?" "Because Caldwell is already moving," she said. "Because he came to my neighbor last night and started talking about the mortgage. Because a man like that moves faster when he thinks you're isolated." She paused. "And because I read your letters 4 times each, and I think you understand something about holding ground when everything around you is pushing you to give it up." Samuel looked at her. "That's a practical reason," he said. "Yes." "Is it the only one?" The kitchen was very quiet. Outside somewhere in the yard, one of the horses shifted, and the sound of it carried through the morning air. "No," Elizabeth said. "It's not the only one." Thomas appeared from the direction of the back room. He had apparently been checking on their mother and had the timing instincts of a boy who understood exactly when to make himself visible and when to stay out of sight. He set a plate of bread on the table and sat down at the end and looked from Samuel to Elizabeth with the expression of someone watching a situation develop and exercising careful restraint about commenting on it. Samuel looked at this boy. "Do you know carpentry?" he asked. Thomas blinked. "Some. Papa taught me to use a hammer, and I can set a nail straight." "Can you cut a line?" "With a saw mostly." "Mostly," Samuel repeated. Not mocking, evaluating. "The last time I cut a board it went 3 degrees off," Thomas said with the precision of someone who has measured his failures carefully. 3 degrees is fixable," Samuel said. "I've seen men build houses with worse. The problem is when people don't measure the angle and don't know it's 3 degrees off. You knew. That's more than half the skill." Thomas straightened slightly. It was almost imperceptible, the adjustment of a boy being taken seriously by an adult who hadn't pre-decided how much he was worth. Elizabeth watched it happen and felt something move through her chest that she didn't immediately name. "The barn roof," she said. "If you wanted something to look at while you're here. The east end is the worst. I've been patching it, but it needs proper work." Samuel looked at her. "You're asking me to work." "I'm asking you to look," she said. "There's a difference." He nodded slowly. After breakfast, they ate. Thomas talked about the fence and the horses, and a mare named Clover, who had developed a bad shoe, and the question of whether the creek on the south boundary was going to dry up entirely before fall. Samuel listened with the focused attention of a man cataloging information rather than making conversation, asking specific questions. When Thomas paused, not polite questions, but technical ones, the kind that indicated he was actually thinking about the problems and not just being agreeable. When Thomas described the creek issue, Samuel asked, "Which direction does it run in the dry season? Is there a secondary channel?" Thomas looked at Elizabeth. "There's a secondary channel about a 1/4 mile west," she said. "My father dug a diversion trench 3 years ago, but it silted up the second summer." "How wide was the original trench?" 2 feet, maybe 3. "That's too narrow," Samuel said. "Water moving that slow will always silt. You'd need 4 feet minimum and a slight grade about 2% downhill. Then you're using the water's own movement to keep the channel clear." Elizabeth looked at him. "I spent 2 years doing irrigation work in Wyoming before the carpentry," he said. He said it without any particular significance, the way people mention relevant experience when it's relevant. "Is there anything you haven't done?" Thomas asked. "Plenty," Samuel said. "But I've done enough to know what a 2% grade looks like and what silting does to a narrow trench." After breakfast, they walked to the barn. Samuel moved through the yard with the particular gait of someone reading a property, his eyes moving in patterns. Elizabeth recognized from the way her father used to walk his own land, checking things with a kind of professional attention that looked casual but wasn't. He glanced at the fence line on the east pasture without commenting. He stopped briefly near the well and looked at the ground around the cap. At the barn, he stood in the doorway for a moment before going in. He looked up at the east end roof without touching anything. "How old is this barn?" he asked. 30 years. My grandfather built it. Good work, originally." He walked the length of it looking up. "The main beams are sound. The problem is the secondary rafters. There are 3 that have bowed, and when they bow, the purlins separate and water gets in at the joints. The shingles are secondary. You can replace shingles every year, and it won't matter if the frame underneath is moving." "Can it be fixed?" "Yes." He stopped. "It's not a small job. 2 weeks of solid work, maybe more. You'd need lumber, I can tell you what to order. And you'd need someone on the roof who knows what they're doing." "Are you offering?" Elizabeth said. He turned to look at her. "I'm telling you what the barn needs," he said. "What happens after that depends on what you want." It was a careful distinction. She heard it clearly. "I want to know why you came," she said. "Not the practical answer, the real one." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "I came," he said, "because your letters sounded like someone who was doing an honest thing instead of an easy one." He looked back up at the roof. "I've spent most of my adult life in places where I was useful and then moved on. Wyoming, Nevada, 3 different Colorado towns, none of which kept me. Because useful is not the same as wanted, and at some point you start to understand the difference." Elizabeth didn't speak. "I wanted to try somewhere I might stay," he said. "That's all. Not rescue, not obligation, just stay." She said, "You could have stayed without the arrangement, without the letters." "I could have," he said, "but the arrangement was honest, and I didn't want to arrive somewhere under false pretenses." A pause. "Though I suppose that's ironic, given what happened at the station." "You weren't under false pretenses," Elizabeth said. "I was under my own assumptions." He looked at her. Then directly, with the steady quality that she was beginning to understand was not coldness, but its opposite. A kind of attention so complete, it was almost uncomfortable to be on the receiving end of. "Miss Carter," he said. "Elizabeth," she said. "If you're going to fix my barn, you should probably use my name." Something moved across his face. Brief, but she saw it. "Elizabeth," he said. That afternoon, while Samuel was measuring the barn rafters, Richard Caldwell came to call. Elizabeth heard his horse first. Caldwell always rode a bay gelding that he kept in good condition, partly for functional reasons, and partly because a well-maintained horse communicated something about a man's means in a way he found useful. She came out of the house to meet him before he could ride into the yard properly, because she had learned that meeting Caldwell at the border of her property set a different tone than meeting him at her door. He stopped his horse when he saw her and smiled the smile that arrived slightly too early. Elizabeth, he said, "I heard you had company." "You heard correctly," she said. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." He looked past her toward the barn, where the sound of Samuel moving on the roof was audible, the careful footsteps of a man testing the structure before trusting it with his weight. After what happened at the station, people were concerned. "People," Elizabeth said. "The community cares about you," Caldwell said. "Your father was well liked. People want to see you safe." "I am safe, Richard." "With a stranger on your property." "With a skilled carpenter assessing my barn roof," she said. "Which needs work, which you'd know if you ever asked about my property for any reason other than acquiring it." Caldwell's smile didn't waver. He had a tremendous tolerance for directness. She had noticed the kind of tolerance that came from not taking opposition personally, because he didn't expect it to last. "I'm concerned about your judgment," he said. That's all. A man arrives looking the way he looks from wherever he came from, and within 48 hours, he's working on your property. His name is Samuel Hayes, Elizabeth said. He's a carpenter and former Army scout from Wyoming. He has references I chose not to request because his letters demonstrated his character more clearly than any reference would. He fixed Gerald Pruitt's Windsor chair yesterday morning without being asked and without payment. He assessed my barn roof this afternoon and identified exactly what's wrong with it and told me what it would take to fix it. He ate breakfast at my table this morning and spoke to my brother like a person and listened to my situation and asked the right questions. She paused. What else would you like to know about him, Richard? Caldwell looked at her for a moment. You're attached to him, he said. I'm not attached to anything. I'm informed. It's fast. Faster than 3 years of you pretending your interest in my land is interest in me. That landed. She watched it land, the slight tightening around his eyes, the recalibration. Caldwell was not accustomed to being named plainly. He operated in the register of implication, and he found directness jarring in the way of someone whose strategy depends on nobody saying the thing out loud. I have always had your best interests at heart, he said. You have always had the Eastern Creek bed at heart, Elizabeth said, and the mineral rights, and the water access. I've known this for 3 years, and I've been polite about it, but I'm finding politeness less useful than I used to. Caldwell's smile finally shifted. Not gone men like him never let the smile go entirely, but different, cooler. Your mortgage comes due in 8 months, he said. I know when my mortgage comes due. Aldrich has been patient. Aldrich will continue to be patient. Will he? Caldwell said. I had coffee with him this week. He's a practical man. Practical men make practical decisions when they see a situation that isn't improving. Elizabeth felt the cold move through her, but kept her face level. Are you telling me you spoke to my banker about my finances? I'm telling you I had coffee with an old friend, Caldwell said. The rest was conversation. He picked up his reins. I'm not your enemy, Elizabeth. I never have been. I'm a man who wants to see this land used well, and I'm offering you a way to protect yourself. Get off my property, she said. He looked at her. Now, Richard, I went. But not fast. He turned his horse slowly, deliberately, and walked it out the way he'd come in at the same measured pace, and the message in that pace was, I am not hurrying. I am not worried. I will be back. Elizabeth stood in the yard until she couldn't hear the horse anymore. Then she heard boots on the barn roof stop moving. She looked up. Samuel was sitting on the ridge where he'd apparently been for some portion of the conversation. He wasn't pretending he hadn't heard. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read from that distance. She said, How much did you hear? Most of it, he said. Good, she said. Then I don't have to explain Caldwell. He climbed down off the roof with the practiced ease of a man who has spent significant time at heights, careful not reckless with the particular economy of movement that comes from having done dangerous work long enough to respect it. He dropped the last few feet to the ground and stood in front of her. That man wants the land, Samuel said. Yes. And he's talking to your banker. Apparently. How much do you owe? Elizabeth told him the number. It was not a small number. She said it the same way she said everything, flatly, without performance. But she watched his face as she said it and saw him absorb it without flinching. That's manageable, he said. She blinked. I'm not asking you. I know you're not. He said it quietly. I'm not offering money. I'm saying the number is manageable if the ranch is producing, and from what I've seen this morning, the ranch has the capacity to produce. The barn roof, the creek channel, the fence on the north pasture, those are fixable problems. Fixable problems are not the same as failing ones. She looked at him. You've been treating them like they're the same, he said. Because you've been alone with them for a year, and they've gotten heavier. He paused. I know what that does to a person's assessment of a situation. Do you? She said. Yes. There was something underneath that word that she heard, but didn't press on. Not yet. Because whatever was underneath it was something he would say when he was ready to say it, and pushing would close the door rather than open it, and she understood this because she had doors of her own that operated on the same principle. "The lumber for the roof," she said. "What do I need to order?" He told her. He told her in the specific practical language of a man who knows materials, lengths and grades and quantities, and the particular type of pine that held in high-altitude weather better than the alternatives. She wrote it down on the paper she pulled from her coat pocket, the pencil she always kept there, and he waited while she wrote and didn't apologize for the detail or soften the technical language. When she finished writing, she looked up. He was watching her write with an expression she recognized from her father. The expression of someone who respects competence and is slightly surprised to find themselves respecting it in a place they hadn't expected to. "I'll go to the lumberyard tomorrow," she said. "I'll come with you," he said. "Otherwise, Harmon will overcharge you." "He always overcharges me." "He won't if I'm there." She thought about pointing out that she was capable of negotiating her own lumber prices and had been doing so for 14 months. She decided not to. Not because she was incapable, but because he wasn't offering to do it instead of her. He was offering to stand next to her, and those were different things. "Fine," she said. They walked back to the house. Thomas was on the porch, supposedly reading his schoolbook, actually watching them with the studious intensity of a boy who has decided to gather data before forming a conclusion. "Is Mr. Hayes fixing the roof?" Thomas asked. "We're discussing it," Elizabeth said. "He needs lumber," Thomas said. "I heard him say what to order. I wrote it down too." He held up his own piece of paper. Samuel looked at the boy. "You wrote it down." "In case she missed something," Thomas said. "She didn't, but in case." A sound came from somewhere in Samuel's chest. That was not quite a laugh. Something shorter and more surprised than a laugh. Something that sounded like the beginning of one stopped before it could become one. But his eyes changed when it happened, and Elizabeth saw the change, and she stored it away without quite acknowledging to herself that she was doing so. Her mother called from inside. Elizabeth went in. Margaret was sitting up in bed a good day, which meant less coughing and a color in her face that approached normal. She looked at Elizabeth with sharp, assessing eyes that illness had not dulled. "I heard a horse earlier," she said. "Caldwell." "What did he want?" "The usual." Elizabeth sat on the edge of the bed. "He's been talking to Aldrich." Margaret's expression didn't change, but her hands folded on the blanket pressed slightly closer together. "How do you know?" "He told me, casually, the way he does things that are meant to frighten you." "Are you frightened?" Elizabeth thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about things with her mother. "I'm concerned," she said. "There's a difference." "What did Hayes say?" "He said the number was manageable if the ranch was producing." Her mother looked at her for a long moment. "Is that all he said?" "He's going to come to the lumber yard with me tomorrow." Margaret was quiet. Then she said, "Bring him in here." "Mama." "I want to meet the man who's working on my barn," Margaret said. "And I want to look him in the eye when I do it." Elizabeth went back to the porch. Samuel was talking to Thomas about the fence this time. Thomas explaining the specific section that had been leaning since spring. Samuel asking questions that indicated he was building a picture of the property's problems in his mind, the same way he'd built a picture of the barn. "My mother wants to meet you," Elizabeth said. Samuel stood. He didn't hesitate or straighten his coat or do anything that suggested the request made him self-conscious. He simply stood and said, "Of course." He followed her inside. At the door of the back room, he stopped and looked at Elizabeth. "She knows about—" He gestured briefly toward his face. "She knows you have scars," Elizabeth said. "She's not a woman who responds to appearances." He nodded. They went in. Margaret Carter looked at Samuel Hayes for a long, unashamed moment. The kind of look that older women with failing health are permitted direct, comprehensive, unencumbered by the social convention that prohibits staring. She looked at his face and his hands and his posture and the way he stood in the doorway of her room, and she took her time about it. Samuel stood still and let her. "Sit down," Margaret said. He sat in the chair beside the bed. "Elizabeth tells me you're a carpenter," Margaret said. "Yes, ma'am." "And a scout." "Formerly." "The Army." It wasn't quite a question. "For 3 years. Civilian contract. I know territory. tracking mapping supply lines. And the scars, Margaret said. Are you going to tell me about them? Elizabeth, standing in the doorway, felt the air in the room change. Not tension exactly. Something more like the particular quality of a moment when truth is about to be said aloud for the first time in a long time. Samuel looked at Margaret Carter with an expression that was the most open thing Elizabeth had seen on his face. Prairie fire, he said. 6 years ago, I was volunteering with a fire crew in eastern Wyoming. A family's homestead caught the grass was tinder that summer. The wind was wrong. They had 4 children. He stopped. The parents got out. I helped with that, but the 2 youngest were still inside. Margaret was very still. I went back in, Samuel said. I got the children out. The roof came down on my way through the last time. He looked at his hands. I survived. They all survived. These... He turned his hands slightly. These are what that cost. Silence. And you've been running from it ever since, Margaret said. Samuel looked up. Not from what you did, she said. From how people react to what it left on you. He was quiet for a long moment. Yes, he said. How long? 6 years. That's long enough, Margaret said. Don't you think? He looked at the woman in the bed, at her clear eyes and her direct manner, and the particular authority of someone who has spent a long time being honest, because life has made dishonesty feel too expensive. I'm starting to, he said. Elizabeth stood in the doorway and listened to her mother talking to a man she'd met 4 minutes ago as though she'd known him for years, and she felt something inside her that had been clenched for 14 months begin very slowly to loosen. Margaret asked him 2 more questions. Practical ones about the barn and the lumber order, and whether he thought the north fence could wait until fall or needed immediate attention. He answered them with the same care he'd given her personal questions, which Elizabeth thought said something important. When they left the room, Thomas was waiting in the hallway with an expression of studied nonchalance. Well, he whispered to Elizabeth. She shook her head at him. He looked past her at Samuel. She liked you, he told him with the certainty of a boy who has been reading his mother's expressions his whole life. Samuel looked at the boy. How do you know? She asked you about the fence, Thomas said. She only asks about practical things when she's decided a person is worth being practical with. Samuel looked at Elizabeth. She said, He's not wrong. It was almost dark by the time Samuel walked back to town. Elizabeth stood on the porch and watched him go, the slight diminishment of his figure against the early evening sky, the steady pace, the particular way he carried himself that she was beginning to recognize as his, specifically as opposed to a general impression of a man. Thomas appeared beside her. He's coming back tomorrow, Thomas said. For the lumber yard. Yes. And after that, Elizabeth looked at her brother. After that depends on what both of us decide, she said. Both, Thomas said. Not just you. Both, she confirmed. That's how it works when you're being honest about it. Thomas thought about this. Papa used to say the hardest part of any repair is admitting what's actually broken. Elizabeth looked at him. I think Mr. Hayes is broken in some ways, Thomas said with the careful precision of a boy who has thought about this for 2 days. I think you might be broken in some ways too. Different ways. He paused. Maybe that's why the letters made sense. She put her hand on her brother's shoulder. He was 12 years old, and he had their father's instincts, and she hoped with everything she had that life didn't make him more cautious about using them. Go to bed, she said. I'm going, he said. But he stayed on the porch for another minute watching the empty road where Samuel had been. Elizabeth, he said. What? When Caldwell came today, and you told him to get off the property. He paused. I was proud of you. She looked at him. Papa would have been too, Thomas said, and went inside. She stood on the porch alone in the evening air, looking at the road, thinking about barn roofs and creek channels and mortgage numbers, and the way a man's voice sounds when he says 6 years and means something far larger than the time. Tomorrow there was the lumber yard. The day after that there was the roof. After that she didn't know yet. But for the first time since the train platform, she thought the not knowing felt less like a threat and more like the beginning of something she didn't have a word for yet. In the house behind her, her mother coughed once and then was quiet. In the barn, a horse shifted in its stall. Somewhere on the road between the ranch and Pine Hollow, a man with scars on his hands walked back to a boarding house where he'd repaired a chair. Nobody asked him to fix, and Elizabeth Carter stood on her father's porch and thought about the difference between a man who does good things because someone is watching and a man who does them because the chair is broken and it bothers him. She already knew which one Samuel Hayes was. The question she was just beginning to ask herself, the one that arrived quietly without announcement in the cool evening air of a Colorado summer, was what she was going to do about it. The lumberyard trip changed things. Not in any dramatic way. Not in the way stories sometimes pretend things change a single moment, where everything pivots and the world rearranges itself around a new center. It changed the way real things change, which is quietly and in accumulation. One small observation, stacking on top of another until the pile becomes something you can no longer ignore. Harmon Briggs ran the Pine Hollow lumber yard with the particular confidence of a man who had operated without serious competition for 20 years and had adjusted his prices accordingly. He was not dishonest in any way that could be proven. He was simply very good at identifying what a person needed and charging precisely what they could bear to pay for it. Elizabeth had been paying his prices for 14 months because she had no alternative and because arguing with Harmon produced a temporary reduction, followed by a permanent deterioration in service quality that cost more in the long run than the original overcharge. She walked in with Samuel beside her and gave Harmon her list. Harmon looked at the list. He looked at Samuel. He looked at the list again. It didn't run Tuesday. It ran Thursday. Elizabeth knew this, and she was fairly certain Samuel knew this, and she was absolutely certain Harmon knew this, and the three of them stood in a brief configuration of shared awareness of the bluff being called. Harmon took them to the back. The negotiation took 40 minutes. Samuel moved through the lumber stock with the focused attention of a man who knows what bad wood looks like and is not embarrassed to say so, pulling boards and checking grain and setting aside everything that had twist or check or the particular dullness that indicated moisture damage. He discarded a third of what Harmon had initially planned to include in the order. Harmon protested twice. Samuel explained his reasoning both times, not combatively, but with the calm specificity of a man who knows he's right and doesn't need to raise his voice about it. By the end, the order was smaller, higher quality, and 14% cheaper than Elizabeth had paid for similar materials the previous fall. Walking back to the wagon, Elizabeth said, "You knew he'd back down." "I knew he'd prefer a deal to a loss," Samuel said. "Those aren't the same thing, but they produce the same result." "You do that often," the bluff. "Only when I'm right about the wood." He climbed up onto the wagon seat. "Being right about the wood matters. If I'd been wrong, he'd have known it, and we'd have lost the ground." She looked at him sitting on the wagon with the calm certainty of a man who does not overreach because he has learned precisely where his reach ends. "You're not what I expected," she said. "No," he said. "I'm not." She climbed up beside him. He handed her the reins without being asked, not as a statement, simply as the natural movement of returning a thing that belonged to her. She drove. By the time the lumber was delivered and stacked, and Samuel had been up on the roof twice more to take final measurements. 3 days had passed since his arrival. The North Road had reopened, and nobody had mentioned him leaving. Not Elizabeth, not Thomas, not even Samuel himself. He simply continued to appear each morning, arriving at the ranch before 8, working through the midday heat with the methodical focus of someone who has learned that steady effort over time produces more than bursts of urgency. He worked on the barn roof. He fixed the section of north fence that Thomas had reported leaning. He looked at the creek channel one afternoon and spent 2 hours walking its length, checking grades with a level and a string line, saying very little. In the evenings he went back to Pruitt's boarding house. He had stopped eating breakfast alone. Elizabeth had started leaving an extra cup on the table, and he had stopped pretending he didn't notice it. Thomas had taken to following him during work hours, not unhelpfully, not underfoot, but with the intense observational focus of a boy absorbing a trade. Samuel had started narrating his work in the quiet, specific way that was not quite teaching and not quite talking to himself, but was somewhere productively between the two. Thomas listened. Occasionally he asked a question. The questions were good enough that Samuel started answering them with more detail than he might have otherwise. Pine Hollow, meanwhile, was conducting a parallel operation. The town had opinions about Samuel Hayes, and the town's opinions had not significantly improved since the station platform. The early stories, the knife fight, the mining accident, the violent history had evolved and merged into a general impression that was not any single specific lie, but was rather the atmosphere of suspicion that forms around a person when enough unverified things have been said about them that people feel they know something, even though they know nothing. Caldwell was the engine of this. Elizabeth understood this clearly now. She saw the mechanics of it every time she went into town, the way a conversation stopped when she entered the feed store, the way Nora Whitfield found reasons to ask about her living arrangements, the way the banker Aldrich greeted her with a warmth that had a careful quality to it, a warmth that was managing something. She said nothing about it to Samuel. I knew. She was certain he knew, because he moved through town with the practiced awareness of a man who has spent years navigating spaces where he is the subject of conversation, rather than a participant in it. He didn't change his behavior. He didn't become more agreeable or more performatively harmless. He continued to be exactly who he was, methodical, competent, honest, quiet, and let the town make of it what they chose. But on the fifth day, something shifted. She heard it from Holt Granger. First again. Holt had become her early warning system, the man at the edge of the community who heard things and chose to share them with her because he had a sense of fairness that Caldwell's money had never been able to buy. Holt came by the ranch in the afternoon while Samuel was on the roof. Caldwell's called a meeting, Holt said. Town hall tomorrow evening. He's framing it as a community safety matter. Elizabeth felt the cold move through her. He's going to make it public. He's going to make Samuel the subject of a public conversation before Samuel has any chance to be known for what he actually is. Holt looked uncomfortable. I want you to know I won't be attending. Other people will. Yes. Who? Holt gave her names. There were enough of them. After Holt left, she stood in the yard for a moment, looking up at the barn roof where Samuel was working his silhouette against the afternoon sky, the sounds of his hammer carrying down in an even, careful rhythm. She climbed up. He heard her on the ladder and looked over without stopping work. He read her face and set the hammer down. What happened? He said. She told him about Caldwell's meeting. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he picked up a nail and looked at it, not at her, at the nail, and was quiet for a long moment. He's smart, Samuel said. Get enough people in a room and frame the question before anyone else can, and you control the answer. He's been doing it for years, Elizabeth said. Just not this publicly. Why publicly now? Because of you. She said it plainly. Because as long as I was alone, he could afford to be patient. You're a variable he didn't plan for, and he's trying to eliminate you before you become established. Samuel turned the nail in his fingers. He doesn't know me, he said. No. But he knows what your face looks like, and he knows what this town is inclined to believe, and that's enough for what he needs. Samuel looked at her. What do you want to do? The question landed simply, not a challenge, not a deflection, just a genuine inquiry from a man who had decided this was her situation and her territory and her right to navigate. I want to go to the meeting, she said. He nodded slowly. All right. You should come, she said. He was quiet. If you're not there, they'll talk about you as though you're a problem to be solved, she said. If you're there, they have to talk to you. People don't always prefer to talk to the person they're discussing, Samuel said. I know. Come anyway. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I'll be there. The town hall. The following evening was full in the particular way of small community events that carry the specific gravity of judgment. Not every seat taken, but every seat that mattered. The ranchers and the merchants and the women whose husbands' opinions moved through town before breakfast. Caldwell was already at the front when Elizabeth arrived, standing with the ease of a man who has arranged a room to his advantage and is satisfied with the arrangement. She walked in with Samuel beside her and Thomas on her other side. Thomas had announced that morning that he was attending and had responded to Elizabeth's attempt to dissuade him by pointing out with a 12-year-old's unassailable logic that he was a member of the Carter household and the household's interests were being discussed, and therefore his presence was not optional. She had let him come. The room registered their entrance. She felt it, the shift, the murmuring, the way people who had been talking stopped talking, and the way the stopped talking was louder than the talking had been. She walked to a seat midway in the room, neither at the back in deference nor at the front in aggression. Samuel sat beside her. Thomas sat on his other side, very straight, with the expression of a boy who has decided his face is a statement. Caldwell looked at them when they sat down. His expression showed a brief calculation, the assessment of an unexpected variable, and then resettled into his practiced warmth. "Elizabeth," he said with the tone of a man welcoming a guest rather than acknowledging an opponent. "I'm glad you came. This concerns you." "I know it does," she said. He called the meeting to order. He was good at it. The opening, the framing, the establishment of concern as the operating emotion, rather than anything that might sound less reasonable. He said he was worried. He said the community had responsibilities to one another. He said that in difficult times, good people needed to look out for good people. He said Samuel Hayes's name for the first time 7 minutes in, and he said it the way you say the name of something you're not sure is safe, with a careful pause on either side of it. He said, "A stranger arrived in our community under circumstances that many of you witnessed. The circumstances raised questions. Questions that haven't been answered. A man named Colton, who ran the dry goods store, and who Elizabeth had always found to be fundamentally decent when Caldwell wasn't in the room with him, said, 'What kind of questions?' Caldwell spread his hands in a gesture of openness. 'That's what I'd like to find out,' he said. 'Who is this man? Where does he come from? What happened to him?' A pause. 'Why is he still here?' The last question was aimed at Elizabeth. Everyone understood it was aimed at Elizabeth. Elizabeth sat still and let it hang in the air. Then Samuel stood up. The room went very quiet. He stood at his full height, which was considerable, and he looked at Caldwell with an expression that was not hostile, and was not placating, and was not the carefully managed neutrality she had seen him use as armor since she'd known him. It was something else, something that had the quality of a decision having been made. "Mr. Caldwell," Samuel said, "you've asked who I am. I'm happy to answer that." Caldwell gestured with the magnanimous courtesy of a man who has set a trap and is inviting you to walk into it. "Please." "My name is Samuel Hayes," Samuel said. "I'm from Casper, Wyoming, by way of several other places that are all part of the same story. I'm a carpenter by trade and a former civilian scout. I came to Pine Hollow because Elizabeth Carter wrote me 4 months of honest letters, and I believed honest letters were worth a train ticket." He paused. "I'm still here because the barn needs a new roof, and I said I'd fix it, and I don't leave jobs half done." A few people in the room shifted, not dramatically, but she saw it. "That answers some questions," Caldwell said. "It doesn't answer others." "Such as?" "Such as?" Caldwell gestured toward him. "What happened to your face, Mr. Hayes? I don't mean that unkindly, but the community has a right to know the character of the men who live within it." The room was very still. Elizabeth felt the collective held breath of a group of people who were deeply interested in the answer, but would not have asked the question themselves. Not out of kindness, but out of the particular social cowardice of communities that prefer someone else to do the aggressive thing so they can benefit from the result while keeping their own hands clean. Samuel said, 6 years ago there was a prairie fire in eastern Wyoming. A family named Brennan, father, mother, 4 children. The 2 youngest were inside the house when the fire reached it. I went in twice. I got the children out. The roof came down on my way out the second time. He held up his hands, turned them so the scarred backs were visible. These are what that looks like 6 years later. The room absorbed this. Then Caldwell said, and his voice was still reasonable, still concerned, still operating in the register of a man managing a public interest. "Can anyone verify that?" It was the right move tactically. Elizabeth felt the room tip back toward doubt, because Caldwell had given it a plausible reason to doubt. And doubt was easier than belief, when doubt cost you nothing, and belief required you to revise an opinion you'd already formed. But before she could speak, a woman in the back of the room said, "I can." Everyone turned. The woman was perhaps 60 years old. She was small and plainly dressed, and she had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who do not speak often in public and know the weight of it when they do. She had arrived late enough to be sitting at the edge of the room, which meant almost nobody had noticed her come in. Elizabeth didn't recognize her. She said, "My name is Clara Brennan. I have been visiting my sister in Denver for the past 2 months. I arrived in Pine Hollow 3 days ago on my way back to Wyoming." She looked at Samuel. "That man went into my house twice. My youngest daughter was 5 years old. She is 11 now, and she is healthy and she is alive because of what that man's hands look like." The room did not murmur. The room was silent in the way of a space where something has shifted irrevocably, and everyone knows it, but nobody has said it yet. Caldwell's expression had not changed, but something behind it had a tightening, a recalculation. He was a man who had built a careful structure and watched someone remove the central beam with a single sentence. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, "I appreciate your—" "I'm not finished," Clara Brennan said. Caldwell stopped. "I came to this meeting because Gerald Pruitt mentioned it at breakfast this morning, and I recognized the name of the man being discussed," she said. "I don't know your town's business. I don't know what this man wants from you." She looked at Caldwell without warmth. "But I know what Samuel Hayes did in eastern Wyoming in the summer of 1880, and I know what my daughter's face looked like when he carried her out of that fire, and I know what his looked like after." She paused. "If your community cannot see the difference between a scar from a crime and a scar from a sacrifice, then your community has a problem that this meeting will not solve." The silence held for a full 5 seconds. Then it broke, not into chaos, into conversation, the particular noise of a room full of people revising their assessments simultaneously, which produced a sound like something coming unstuck. Elizabeth was looking at Caldwell, who was already regrouping. She could see it the way he squared his shoulders slightly, the way his eyes moved across the room, calculating who was still with him, what remaining angle of approach was viable. Caldwell was not the kind of man who accepted a lost moment. He was the kind of man who waited for the next one. She stood up. The room didn't go completely quiet this time, but it shifted, people hearing her chair and looking. "I have something to say," Elizabeth said. She didn't look at Caldwell. She looked at the people in the room. People she had known her whole life. People who had attended her father's funeral and brought food to her mother and watched her try to hold the ranch together for 14 months. "You all know me," she said. "You knew my father. You know this land, and you know what it cost my family to build it." She paused. "And you know Richard Caldwell. You know he's wanted that land for 3 years. You know every offer he's made. You know what's underneath those offers." The room was listening. "He called this meeting because a man arrived in our community who doesn't serve his interests," Elizabeth said. "Not because he's worried about community safety. Because a man arrived who might give me a reason to hold my ground, and that man's face gave Caldwell the tool he needed to make you doubt him before you knew him." Caldwell said, "Elizabeth, I understand you feel—" "I'm not finished," she said. It was exactly what Clara Brennan had said. The echo of it was deliberate. Caldwell closed his mouth. "Samuel Hayes has been on my property for 5 days," she said. "In 5 days, he assessed my barn roof, ordered the right materials at a fair price, because he knew what Harmon was going to try to charge me, and he stopped it. Fixed a section of fence that's been leaning since spring, walked my creek channel for 2 hours, to figure out why my father's diversion trench silted up, and sat with my mother for 20 minutes, talking about practical things because she asked him to." She paused. "He's done all of this without being asked to prove himself, without performing, without asking for anything in return except to be seen as a person first and a face second." The room was completely still. "I asked him to step back from the arrangement after the station," she said. "You all saw it. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I looked at his face, and I let what I saw override what I knew from 4 months of letters, and that was a failure of judgment on my part, and I've owned it." She looked at Samuel. "But I'm not making the same mistake twice." She took 1 step toward him. Then she took his hand. The room made a sound. She felt it, rather than heard it, the collective intake and release of a group of people confronting something they hadn't prepared for. Samuel went completely still. She felt his hand, the texture of the burn scars on the back of it, the roughness of the work calluses underneath the slight tension of a man who had not expected this, and was not sure what it meant, and was very carefully not showing how much it mattered. "You see scars," she said to the room, to Caldwell, to all of them. "You decided they told you what kind of man he is before he spoke a single word." Her hand tightened around his. "But I know what made those scars. And I know the man who carries them. And he is not a danger to this community. He is exactly the kind of man a community needs and rarely deserves." Caldwell said, "This is sentiment, not—" "Sit down, Richard," Holt Granger said from 3 rows back. It was said quietly, without drama. But Holt Granger's voice carried the particular weight of a man who almost never says anything in a public room, and who has therefore accumulated years of unspent authority that lands hard when he finally spends it. Caldwell sat. Elizabeth looked at Samuel. His expression was not what she expected. She had expected she didn't know what she expected. Relief, perhaps. Or gratitude. Something that corresponded to the size of what she'd just done in front of these people. What she saw instead was something much quieter and much more difficult to look at directly. It was the expression of a man who has spent 6 years believing a specific thing about himself and has just encountered the first significant evidence that he might have been wrong. His hand, which had been still turned slightly in hers. Not pulling away. Holding. Thomas, sitting 1 chair over, watched this with the expression of a 12-year-old who is successfully not saying "I told you so" and deserves significant credit for the restraint. Clara Brennan stood up from her chair at the edge of the room and walked toward them. She stopped in front of Samuel and looked at him with the expression of a woman looking at someone she has thought about for 6 years. "My daughter drew a picture of you," she said, "when she was 6. She couldn't get your face right because she was 6 and she couldn't draw. But she knew what she wanted to draw." She paused. "She still has it." Samuel said nothing. But Elizabeth felt his hand change a slight increase in pressure, so slight it was almost nothing, just enough to know it was there. "Thank you," Clara Brennan said. "For the 6 years I got to watch her grow." The meeting dissolved after that. Not triumphantly, real things rarely dissolved. Triumphantly, they dissolved the way rooms empty at the end of a long day, with people moving in 1s and 2s, conversations, breaking off the energy of a held position, releasing into the ordinary air. Caldwell left without speaking to Elizabeth. He didn't look at her on the way out. That was new. It was she understood, not the end of him. Caldwell was not the kind of man who accepted a public reversal as a final result. He would recalculate. He would find a new approach. He would wait, because waiting was his particular skill, and he had a patience built on money and the certainty that most situations eventually resolved in his favor if he stayed close enough to them. But he had lost the room tonight, and losing the room had cost him something he couldn't simply buy back. Outside the town hall, in the cool night air, Clara Brennan pressed a piece of paper into Samuel's hand. "My address in Wyoming," she said. "If you ever want to meet the girl who couldn't draw your face." She looked at Elizabeth. "Take care of him," she said, and walked away. Elizabeth looked at Samuel. I was looking at the piece of paper in his hand. His expression had the quality of a man handling something fragile, not because the paper was fragile, but because what it represented was, and he knew it, and he was being careful with it. Thomas appeared from behind them. He had apparently been standing close enough to hear everything, and had the good sense to look as though he hadn't. "We should go home," Thomas said. "Mama will want to know what happened." "Yes," Elizabeth said. They began walking. Samuel walked beside her, not behind her, not ahead, beside which was a small thing, and not a small thing simultaneously. After a few minutes he said, "You didn't tell me you were going to do that." "No," she said. "The hand." "No." "Why not?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because if I'd planned it, it would have been a performance," she said. "And you've had enough of those." He walked beside her in silence for a while. Then he said, What does this mean, Elizabeth practically? She understood the question. He was asking about the arrangement. The original arrangement. The letters, the train ticket, the ring box that had closed on the platform and not been mentioned since. She said, "It means you're not a stranger here anymore. What it means after that..." She paused. "What it means after that is a conversation, a real one, between two people who've been honest with each other. When we're ready to have it." "When will that be?" "When the roof is finished," she said. She heard something in his breathing. Not quite a laugh. Not the beginning of one this time, but the sound that exists just before someone stops being braced for impact and starts being present in a moment instead. "The roof," he said. "All right." "4 more days of work," she said. "If the weather holds." "It'll hold," he said. "You can't know that." "I know this territory," he said. "I spent 3 years reading weather for the army. It'll hold." Thomas, walking on Samuel's other side, said, "It rained last August for 6 days straight." "Different pressure system," Samuel said. Thomas considered this. "You can tell the difference." "When you've been outside as much as I have, yes." Thomas absorbed this with the seriousness he applied to new information. "Will you teach me to read weather?" "Yes." "I can try," Samuel said. "It takes practice, and you have to be willing to be wrong and learn from it." "I measured my saw cut to 3 degrees, Thomas said. "I know how to be wrong about something and fix it." Samuel made the sound again, the sound that lived just before a laugh. The one Elizabeth had been noticing and cataloging since the first morning in the kitchen. Thomas heard it too. He looked past Samuel at Elizabeth with the expression of a boy who has accomplished something and is being judicious about the celebration. They were halfway home before Elizabeth realized that for the entire walk from the town hall, she had not once thought about the mortgage. She thought about it now, the number, the 8 months. Caldwell's careful mention of Aldrich's name. It hadn't gotten smaller. The situation hadn't changed. But something in how she held it had. She was still thinking about this when they reached the ranch. Thomas went ahead to check on their mother. Elizabeth and Samuel stopped at the yard gate, the natural boundary, the place where the evening ended and the night began, and whatever came next was still on the other side of a conversation they hadn't had yet. He said, "I should tell you something." She looked at him. "The reason I came through the advertisement," he said. "Not the practical answer, the real one." She waited. "I had a place in Wyoming," he said. "A house I'd built myself. Good land, good neighbors. 3 years after the fire, I had started to believe I might stay." He paused. "There was a woman. She knew about the fire. She said the scars didn't matter. We talked about marrying." He stopped. "Then her father came to meet me, and he saw my face. And 3 days after that she told me it wasn't going to work." Elizabeth was very still. "She wasn't a bad person," Samuel said. "She was someone who had been talked out of a decision by someone she trusted more than herself." "I understood that. I still understand it." He looked at the gate. "But I couldn't stay in the town after, so I left. And I kept leaving. And after 3 or 4 towns, I understood that I was going to keep leaving unless I found somewhere I arrived before the story arrived ahead of me." "The letters," Elizabeth said. "In a letter I was just words," he said. "Just what I actually was, not what I looked like, just what I wrote." He looked at her. "Your letters wrote back to what I actually was, for 4 months. And I thought maybe." He paused. "I was wrong about the station." "I was wrong about the station," Elizabeth said. "We were both wrong," he said. "For different reasons." "Yes." I was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to stay here, not because of the arrangement, because of Thomas measuring saw cuts to 3 degrees, because of your mother asking me about the fence." He looked at her directly. "Because of what you did tonight in that room." She looked back at him. "The conversation," he said. "The real one, about what comes next." He paused. "I'm ready to have it before the roof is finished." She said, "So am I." Above them, the sky had the clarity that came after weather. Every star visible, the dark so complete that the stars looked almost close enough to be useful. Somewhere inside the house, Thomas was telling his mother what had happened in the town hall. She could hear the rhythm of his voice through the wall, the particular cadence of a 12-year-old who has witnessed something significant and is working hard to describe it accurately. She heard her mother's voice respond. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was warm. She looked at Samuel. He was looking at the house, at the light in the windows, at the ordinary shape of it against the dark sky, at the particular way a building looks when there are people inside it who are alive and talking and doing the small, crucial work of an evening. His expression had the quality of a man looking at something he has thought about from a long distance and is now close enough to touch. She opened the gate. "Come in," she said. "Mama will want to hear it from you." He followed her inside. Margaret Carter had a gift for knowing when something important had shifted. She couldn't always name it. She couldn't always articulate the specific change in the air of a room, or the particular quality of a silence that told her the world had just reorganized itself around a new fact. But she had possessed this gift for 51 years, and illness had not taken it from her. And when Elizabeth and Samuel came through the door that evening, she looked at them both for exactly 3 seconds and said nothing at all, which was in Margaret's language the loudest thing she could have said. Thomas was already at her bedside mid-sentence in his account of the town hall, and he had the instincts to stop talking when they walked in and let the room hold what it was holding. Samuel stood in the doorway of the back room. He had been in this room once before the 20-minute conversation with Margaret about fences and creek channels that Elizabeth had watched with the particular attention of someone observing something they couldn't quite name. He stood there now with the same quality of stillness, but it was a different stillness. Not the careful neutrality of a man managing his exposure. Something that had put its armor down. Margaret looked at him. "Sit," she said. He sat. "Thomas tells me you stood up in that room," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "And that Elizabeth took your hand." A pause. "Yes." "In front of Richard Caldwell." "In front of everyone," Samuel said. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My husband took my hand in front of everyone once, at a town meeting 1861. Half the room thought he was making a fool of himself." She looked at her hands on the blanket. He didn't care. That was the thing about Robert. He knew what mattered, and he didn't care who was watching when he showed it. She looked up at Samuel. "Do you know what mattered tonight?" Samuel looked at her steadily. "I think so." "Tell me." "Elizabeth chose truth over comfort in a room full of people who preferred comfort," he said. "That matters. Not because of what it means for me, because of what it says about who she is." Margaret Carter looked at the man sitting beside her bed for a long moment. Then she made a sound that was not quite approval and not quite satisfaction, but was the vocal equivalent of something being confirmed. "You'll do," she said. Thomas, from his position at the end of the bed, caught Elizabeth's eye and made the very small expression of a boy exercising extraordinary willpower. They stayed another hour. Margaret asked Samuel questions, real questions, the kind she asked when she had decided someone was worth understanding, rather than simply evaluating. She asked about Wyoming. About the carpentry specifically, how he had learned, who had taught him, what he had built that he was proudest of. He answered without performance in the same direct particular way. He answered everything. And she listened with the focused attention of a woman whose world had contracted to this room and this bed, and who therefore treated good conversation as the valuable resource it was. When she tired, the coughing came back quietly toward the end. A reminder. Elizabeth walked Samuel to the door. They stood on the porch in the dark. The conversation they had said they were ready to have was right there, close enough to touch, and they both knew it. Elizabeth said, "The ring box." He said, "Yes." "Do you still have it?" A pause. "Yes." She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to open it tonight," she said. "I'm asking if you still want to." He looked at her for a long time. Long enough that she heard a horse shift in the barn, and the wind move through the dry grass, and the quiet sound of a summer night doing what summer nights do. "Yes," he said. "I still want to." "Then we'll talk about it properly," she said. "After the roof." He almost smiled. She was learning the geography of his face, the specific movements that meant what they meant. The almost smile that was actually more than a full smile on another man, because it cost more to produce. "After the roof," he said. "All right." He left. She stood on the porch until she couldn't hear his footsteps anymore, and then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while, not thinking about anything specific, just sitting with the fact that something had changed, and the change was not frightening. Thomas came to the kitchen doorway in his nightclothes. "You should sleep," he said. "You sound like Mama." "Someone has to." She looked at her brother. "Go to bed, Thomas." "Are you happy?" he said. The question arrived simply the way only a 12-year-old could ask it, without the layers of social caution that adults pack around direct inquiries into emotional states. She thought about it honestly. "I think I'm getting there," she said. He nodded, as though this were a satisfactory engineering report. "Good," he said, and went to bed. Caldwell moved faster than she'd expected. She should have anticipated it. She had told herself in the yard on the evening of Caldwell's first visit that patient men with money had a way of eventually getting what they wanted, and she had been right about his patience, but she had underestimated how quickly his patience could convert to urgency when he felt the ground shifting beneath him. 2 days after the town hall meeting, she went to see Aldrich at the bank. The visit was routine. She had a monthly conversation with the banker about the state of the account, the status of the mortgage, the general arithmetic of keeping things together. Aldrich was a careful, methodical man who wore his hair parted precisely on the left side and kept his office in a state of such perfect order that Elizabeth had always found it vaguely threatening. He greeted her with the warm but managing quality she had noticed last week, and she understood within the first 2 minutes that something had happened since their last meeting. She let him talk for a while about the summer markets, about cattle prices in Denver, about the general condition of small ranch operations in the territory. Aldrich was building toward something, and she let him build, watching the architecture of it. He arrived at it with the particular care of a man who has rehearsed. "Elizabeth," he said, "I want to talk to you about the terms of your mortgage." "I know the terms," she said. "There's been a discussion about restructuring." She was very still. "What kind of restructuring?" "The board met last week." He shifted some papers on his desk. "Given the general instability of single-owner operations of this scale, there's been a conversation about accelerating the timeline." "Accelerating," she said. "Meaning calling the note early." "Not calling it, adjusting the schedule. An accelerated payment structure that would—" "Who proposed this?" she said. Aldrich straightened slightly. "The board meets collectively. It's not an individual. Aldrich." She said his name the same way she had said Caldwell's, not loudly, not with heat, but with the particular precision of someone removing all surrounding context and leaving only the essential question. "Who proposed the restructuring?" A pause. A slight adjustment in his posture that was not quite a flinch, but was in that family. "Richard Caldwell joined the bank's advisory board last month," Aldrich said. "As a significant depositor, he has a voice in—" "He joined the advisory board," Elizabeth said. "Last month, yes." She understood the full picture now. It had the clean, unpleasant logic of a well-planned thing. Caldwell had seen Samuel arrive, had seen the town hall go wrong, had lost the public approach, and had pivoted without hesitating to the mechanism he had always had available but hadn't needed to use yet. He had put himself inside the structure that controlled her mortgage, and he was going to use that position to create a crisis she couldn't publicly fight because it would happen in board meetings and administrative processes where his influence was invisible. "How long do I have?" she said. The new schedule would require a significant payment by the 1st of October. Aldrich said the number. It was not the full mortgage. It was approximately a third of it. But it was, she understood exactly precisely the amount that she could not produce in 6 weeks without selling either the cattle or the land itself, which was the point. She stood up. "I'll need that in writing," she said. "The new schedule, the board decision, the full documentation of who voted for what." "Elizabeth." "In writing, Aldrich. Everything. I'll be back for it tomorrow morning." She walked out of the bank. She stood on the boardwalk outside for 45 seconds, doing the arithmetic she already knew the answer to, confirming the numbers she already knew were not in her favor. Then she walked to the lumber yard, where Samuel was picking up the last of the materials for the roof. He looked at her face when she came around the corner and set down what he was carrying. "What happened?" he said. She told him, standing in the lumber yard with Harmon Briggs pointedly organizing boards at the far end and almost certainly listening to every word. Samuel listened without moving. When she finished, he said, "October 1st. 6 weeks. And the amount?" She told him. Howe was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man without ideas. The silence of a man running calculations. The particular focused quiet she had learned to recognize in him over the past week as the sound of real thought rather than delay. "How many cattle can you sell without compromising the herd's breeding capacity?" he said. "Maybe 20. 25 if I'm careful about which ones. At current prices, about 60% of what I need." "The timber lot on the eastern boundary," he said. "Your father mentioned it in the letters you shared. Old-growth pine." She blinked. She had forgotten, not forgotten, but had put it in the category of assets that were too complicated to liquidate quickly. Her father had planted the lot 20 years ago as a long investment, and it had grown into something genuinely valuable, but selling timber rights required documentation and negotiation, and time she'd thought she didn't have. "That lot is worth twice what you need," Samuel said. "Probably 3 times, and there are 3 buyers in Denver who would move quickly on it, because old-growth pine in this territory is rare enough that they don't wait when it comes available." "How do you know that?" "Because I spent 2 years doing carpentry in Denver before Wyoming," he said. "I know who buys good timber, and I know what they'll pay for it, and I know they keep agents in the territory." He looked at her. "You don't have to sell the land itself, just the timber rights on that section. You retain the land. You meet the payment. Caldwell gets nothing." She stared at him. "I know these buyers," he said again steadily. "I have names. I have contacts. I can write the letters today and have a response within 2 weeks if we go through the Denver agent." He paused. "I can't make this decision for you, but I'm telling you the option exists." "You've been thinking about this," she said. "Since Holt Granger came to the ranch," he said. "Since the night you told me about Caldwell's first visit." She looked at him. "You didn't say anything." "It wasn't my place to say anything until it was necessary." He held her gaze. "Now it's necessary." She thought about being angry at him for thinking about her problems without telling her. She decided she wasn't angry. She decided that a man who had spent a week quietly mapping the exits of her situation because he thought she might need them was not a man who deserved anger for the quality of his attention. "Write the letters," she said. They went back to the ranch. Samuel wrote at the kitchen table, while Elizabeth reviewed the timber lot documentation she kept in her father's study. 3 years of records she had maintained carefully because her father had taught her that documentation was the foundation of any argument you might someday need to make. Thomas sat across from Samuel at the table, ostensibly doing schoolwork, actually watching Samuel write with the focused attention of a student observing a master. "Your handwriting is very clear," Thomas said. "It needs to be," Samuel said, not stopping. "You write to a business contact the same way you cut a board. Clean lines, no ambiguity." "What are you telling them?" "That there is a timber lot of specific dimensions, specific age, specific grade, that is available for rights purchase on a compressed timeline, and that I know their business needs and believe this is a transaction worth their immediate attention." "How do you know their business needs?" "Because I worked for one of them for 7 months and talked to the other at a materials auction in '82. He finished a sentence. "Relationships don't expire. They just go dormant." Thomas absorbed this. "So knowing people is like knowing about wood." Samuel glanced at him. "How do you mean?" "If you understand the grain," Thomas said carefully, "you know how it'll behave under pressure, and that doesn't change even if you haven't worked with that piece in a while." Samuel set down his pen. He looked at the boy for a moment, with an expression Elizabeth had learned to read the expression he wore when something had surprised him by being better than he expected. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly right." Thomas looked very carefully at his schoolbook and said nothing, but his ears went slightly red, which was the only external indicator of satisfaction he permitted himself. The letters went out the next morning. The waiting was the hardest part. Not because Elizabeth was unaccustomed to waiting 14 months of managing a failing ranch, was essentially an extended exercise in waiting for things to either improve or collapse, but because this waiting had a specific shape and a specific deadline, and inside that shape Caldwell was moving in ways she couldn't fully see. She found out what he was doing on the third day. Holt Granger came again. He was becoming a reliable carrier of information she needed and hated having, and she was grateful for him in the specific way. You're grateful for people who tell you difficult truths at some cost to themselves. Caldwell was talking to the other ranchers, not threatening. Caldwell never threatened. He was suggesting with the particular reasonableness of a man who has positioned himself as a voice of community concern that the Carter Ranch might need to be reconsidered as a going concern. That the mortgage situation was fragile. That an operation being run by a woman of limited experience and a stranger of unknown origin was perhaps not the stable neighbor any of them needed on their boundaries. I was building the case for her failure before the failure happened, so that when the payment deadline arrived and she couldn't meet it, as he was engineering her to be unable to meet it, the community would already be prepared to accept the outcome as inevitable rather than manufactured. She told Samuel that evening. He listened. He was getting better at this, at listening to the full thing before responding, at not filling the space with reassurance before he understood the problem. She had noticed this about him over the past week. He had learned how she needed to be heard, and he had adjusted to it, and he did it without making a point of doing it. "He's not going to stop," Samuel said. "No. Even if the timber sale goes through, he'll find another angle," she said. "He's been at this for 3 years. One blocked move doesn't stop a man like that. It just changes the direction." "Then we need to remove his leverage entirely," Samuel said. "Not just for October. Permanently." She looked at him. "How?" "The advisory board position. He has influence at the bank because he's a significant depositor. But a significant depositor is only significant if the bank values his relationship more than the alternative." "What alternative?" "There are 2 other banks with territorial reach," Samuel said. "One in Denver, one in Colorado Springs. If you move your accounts, or more importantly, if several of the neighboring ranchers move their accounts. Aldrich's board has a different calculation to make about whose advice is worth listening to." "You'd need Holt," she said, "and the McKenzie brothers, and possibly Dorsey." "I've met Holt twice," Samuel said. "I haven't met the others, but you have." She looked at him. "This is your community," he said. "Not mine yet. These are your relationships. I can tell you what needs to happen. You're the one who can make it happen." He paused. "I'm not trying to manage this for you. I'm thinking alongside you. Thinking alongside you." She sat with that phrase for a moment. 14 months of carrying every decision alone, every calculation, every compromise, every middle-of-the-night arithmetic exercise. And now, there was someone across the table doing the same calculations, not to take the problem from her, but to work it with her. "I'll talk to Holt tomorrow," she said. Holt said yes within 10 minutes of her explaining the situation. He said yes with the flat, unceremonious directness of a man who had been waiting for a viable option and was relieved to find one. He said he'd talk to the McKenzie brothers, who he described as men with long memories for the specific ways Caldwell had maneuvered around their boundaries over the years. He said Dorsey was independent-minded enough to move his accounts on principle if the principle was sound. "This is going to make Caldwell dangerous," Holt said. "You understand that. A man like him, when he feels the ground moving, he doesn't just adjust, he pushes." "I know," Elizabeth said. "Hayes," Holt said. "Is he solid?" "Yes." "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Holt nodded. "Then let's see what Caldwell does when he's not the only one with leverage." The response from Denver came on the 9th day. Samuel brought the letter from town at a pace that was not quite running, but was faster than his usual deliberate walk, and Elizabeth saw him coming across the yard and felt her heartbeat change before she had read a single word. He handed her the letter. She opened it. The timber buyer's agent was interested. More than interested. He had written the word exceptional regarding the lot specifications, and had made an offer that was not a negotiating opener. It was a final number made quickly from a man who knew the value of moving fast on good timber before someone else did. The number was enough. More than enough. It covered October's accelerated payment, left a significant portion of the original mortgage principal retired, and left a remainder that restructured the remaining debt into something manageable enough that Aldrich's board, minus Caldwell's leverage, would have no reasonable basis for further acceleration. She stood in the yard holding the letter and felt something happen in her chest that took her a moment to identify. Not relief exactly. Something that came after relief. The particular quality of a pressure that has been so constant you stopped noticing it suddenly releasing, so that the absence feels almost as disorienting as the pressure itself had been. Samuel was watching her. "It's enough," she said. "Yes," he said. "I thought it would be." "You were certain." "I was confident," he said. "There's a difference. Certain is what you are when you can't be wrong. Confident is what you are when you've done your homework." She looked at him. "What's the difference in practice?" "Certain men don't prepare for being wrong," he said. "Confident men do." She folded the letter. She thought about Caldwell, about the advisory board maneuver, about the 6 weeks he had engineered, about the careful architecture of pressure he had built around her over 3 years. She thought about what this letter meant for that architecture. "I need to go to the bank," she said. "I'll come." "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," he said. "I'm coming." They went together. Aldrich read the timber sale documentation with the careful attention of a man who understands exactly what it means and is doing the internal arithmetic of his own position as he reads. He was quiet for a long time when he finished. "This is sufficient," he said. "More than sufficient." "I'd like the accelerated schedule withdrawn," Elizabeth said. "In writing, and I'd like the full board minutes from the meeting where it was proposed." Aldrich looked up. "I'm entitled to them," she said. "They pertain to my account." A pause. "I'll have them prepared." "Today," she said. Another pause. "Today." Samuel said nothing during the entire exchange. He sat beside Elizabeth with the quality of a man who is present without being dominant, whose presence fills a space without crowding it. His scarred hands were visible on the table. He didn't hide them or position them deliberately. They were simply there the way the rest of him was there, unambiguously, without apology. Aldrich kept not looking at the hands, and then looking at them, and then looking away again, which Elizabeth noticed and filed. Walking out of the bank, she said, "He's going to tell Caldwell." "Probably within the hour," Samuel agreed. "And Caldwell will need time to adjust," Samuel said. "The bank leverage is gone. The timber lot is committed. The neighboring ranchers are moving their accounts. Holt told me this morning the Mackenzies confirmed last night." He paused. "He still has options. Men like him always have options. But his fastest path to your land just closed." She stopped walking. He stopped a step later and turned. "I want to ask you something," she said. He waited. "You knew all of this," she said. "The timber buyer contacts, the bank restructuring, the calculation about neighboring accounts. You knew it before October became a crisis." "Yes." "How long?" "Since the second day," he said. "Since I walked the property and understood what it was and what it was worth and what it would take to hold it." She looked at him. "You didn't say any of it." "No." "Why?" I was quiet for a moment. "Because I was a stranger," he said. "Because I had no right to walk onto a woman's property and tell her how to manage it within 48 hours of her having stepped back from me on a train platform." He held her gaze. "Because even if I'd been right about every single thing saying it, then it would have been making myself necessary before you'd decided whether you wanted me here at all. And I didn't want you to keep me because I was useful. I wanted to stay because you chose it." The boardwalk was not crowded. 2 women with a child passed on the far side. Someone came out of the dry goods store and glanced at them and moved on. Elizabeth looked at Samuel Hayes at his face, which she had learned over 10 days, in a way that made the first 10 seconds on the train platform feel like something that had happened to a different person. She looked at his hand, which had pulled 2 children out of a burning house and spent 6 years carrying the proof of it. She looked at the steadiness of him, the particular quality she had been trying to name since the second morning in the kitchen, and had finally, standing on a boardwalk in Pine Hollow, Colorado, in the summer of 1886, found the word for trustworthy. Not trustworthy in the easy sense, in the hard sense, the sense that meant he had been in a position to manipulate her situation and had chosen not to repeatedly because he valued her agency more than his own advantage. She said, "The roof is finished." He looked at her. "You finished the last section this morning," she said. "I watched you put the last ridge cap on from the kitchen window." A pause. "I did." "So," she said. "The conversation." "The conversation," he said. She said, "Take the ring box out of your coat." He went very still. "I've been thinking about it for 10 days, she said. "I know my answer. I'd like to not make you wait any longer for it." He reached into his coat and took out the small dark box and held it in his scarred hand. She looked at it. She looked at him. "Open it," she said. He opened it. The ring inside was simple, a plain gold band with a small inset stone, unpretentious, made to last rather than to impress. It was, she thought, exactly the ring a man like Samuel Hayes would choose. Not because he couldn't afford better, but because better wasn't the point. "I need to ask you something first," he said. "Ask. If I hadn't been able to solve the mortgage problem, if the timber buyer had said no, and the bank leverage had held, and October had come with no solution." He looked at her steadily. "Would you still be standing here?" She understood the question. It was the most important question he had asked her, more important than anything in 4 months of letters, because it was asking whether she was choosing him or choosing the solution he represented. "Yes," she said. "You're sure?" "I was standing here before the letter came from Denver," she said. "I was standing here the morning after the town hall. I was standing here the night you told me about Wyoming and the woman whose father talked her out of her own decision." She paused. "The mortgage was always my problem to solve. You helped me solve it. But that's not why I'm standing here." He looked at her for a long moment. "Then yes," he said. "My answer is yes. If yours is." "Yes," she said. "Mine is." I took the ring from the box, and she held out her hand, and he put it on her finger, standing on the boardwalk in Pine Hollow in the middle of the morning, with 2 women from the dry goods store watching from across the street, and neither of them paying the slightest attention to that fact. It fit. Of course it fit. He was a man who measured things. She looked at her hand. She looked at him. "We should tell Mama," she said. "We should tell Mama." He agreed. "She'll say something like, 'Well, it took long enough.'" "She'd be right," he said. 12 days, Elizabeth said. 4 months of letters, he said. And 12 days. They began walking back toward the edge of town where the wagon was tied. After a moment, she said, "Thomas is going to be impossible about this." "I know." "He's going to say he knew from the first morning." "He did," Samuel said. "He told me yesterday." She stopped. "He told you," he said, and I'm quoting precisely, "I knew it was going to work out. I just wasn't sure how long you were going to take about it." She looked at the sky. 12 years old, she said. "He's not wrong," Samuel said. She looked at him. He was almost smiling, the real version now, not the almost the one she had been watching develop over 12 days, like something deciding it was safe to grow. "No," she said. "He's not wrong." They walked back to the wagon, and she let him hand her up, and he climbed up beside her, and she picked up the reins. Behind them, Pine Hollow went about its business. Somewhere in it, Richard Caldwell was sitting in his office or his house or someone else's office recalculating. She knew he was. She knew this was not finished in the way that clean endings are finished. But for the moment, driving home to tell her mother and her brother about a ring on her finger and a roof that was finished and a conversation that had finally been had, she let that knowledge sit quietly in the back of her mind, where it could wait. The horse knew the road home. She let it go at its own pace. Beside her, Samuel sat in the particular way he had, present, steady, not filling the silence with noise, because he had learned that silence was not a problem to be solved. She thought about her father, about the letter to a Wyoming paper in February, about a Tuesday morning on a train platform and the sound of a ring box closing, and a man who had expected rejection and received confirmation and absorbed it with the terrible practiced grace of someone who has been told enough times. She thought about the way the whole thing could have ended there. One step backward. One moment of fear overriding 4 months of evidence. "Tomorrow," he said, "if the weather holds." "You said it would hold." "It will hold," he said. She faced the road ahead. It was a good road. Not easy. It had never been easy, and she had stopped expecting easy 14 months ago and would not start again. But it was hers. And now, for the first time in a long time, she was not driving it alone. Caldwell moved on a Thursday, not with a visit, not with a conversation, not with any of the gradual approaches he had been using for 3 years. He moved the way a man moves when he has decided that patience has run its course and urgency is the only remaining instrument. Elizabeth found out about it the same way she had found out about most things Caldwell did from Holt Granger, who appeared at the ranch before 7 in the morning with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man carrying news that could not wait for a more convenient hour. "He's filed a claim," Holt said, "against the timber sale." Elizabeth went very still. "On what grounds?" "He's arguing the timber lot has a prior encumbrance, a lien from a debt your father allegedly owed him personally. He filed it with the Territorial Recorder's office in Denver yesterday afternoon." Holt looked uncomfortable in the way of a man who respects the person he's delivering bad news to. "If the claim holds, the timber sale proceeds get frozen pending resolution, which means the payment to Aldrich doesn't clear, which means October 1st arrives and you're in default." Samuel was standing in the kitchen doorway. He had been there since Holt rode in. He had heard the horse and come from the barn, and had been listening from the doorway, with the stillness of a man absorbing information and running it through calculations simultaneously. "Is there documentation," Samuel said, "for the alleged debt?" Holt looked at him. "He filed papers. Whether they're legitimate—" "They're not," Elizabeth said. Both men looked at her. Then Samuel said, "Where are the papers?" "Study, 3 boxes, organized by year." He was already moving. She followed him. They spent the next 2 hours going through her father's records with the focused efficiency of 2 people who have learned in a short time how to work together without wasting motion. Samuel read quickly and retained what he read. She had noticed this about him, the particular quality of attention he gave to written things, and Elizabeth knew the filing system well enough to navigate it at speed. There was no record of a debt to Caldwell, not a hint of one, not a payment, not a correspondence, not a promissory note, not a single line in 30 years of meticulous record-keeping that suggested her father had ever borrowed money from Richard Caldwell or owed him anything beyond the ordinary courtesies of neighboring landowners. What there was buried in a folder from 11 years ago was something else entirely. Samuel found it. He went quiet when he found it, the particular quiet of a man who has located something significant and is taking a moment to understand its full dimensions before speaking. "Elizabeth," he said. She looked up from the box she was searching. He handed her a document. It was a letter written in her father's hand, dated 11 years ago. It described a specific conversation with a specific witness present, in which Richard Caldwell had approached Robert Carter with a proposal to jointly purchase the mineral rights on 3 adjacent properties. Her father had declined. The letter documented the decline and the reason for it. Caldwell's proposal had included a clause that would have given him unilateral control of the joint venture after 5 years, effectively transferring her father's share to Caldwell's ownership without compensation. Her father had written the letter to himself. A record of the conversation witnessed and dated kept in his files because Robert Carter was a man who understood that some conversations needed to exist on paper. Below it in the same folder was a second document. A deed transfer record, partial a copy, rather than an original, showing that the 3 properties Caldwell had wanted to acquire jointly had all changed hands within 7 years of that conversation. In each case, the previous owner had sold under conditions that read in sequence, told a very particular story about financial pressure and manufactured debt, and a patient man with money and a long horizon. Elizabeth read both documents twice. Then she sat back and looked at Samuel. "He's been doing this for 30 years, she said. "At least," Samuel said. "Those 3 families." She looked at the deed records. The Holloways, the Pratt family, the Sutter claim. She paused. I remember the Holloways. I was 8 years old. They left in the spring. Mama said it was because the land wasn't working for them. She stopped. It wasn't the land. Samuel was watching her with the steady attention he always gave her when she was working something out, not filling the space, not rushing her toward a conclusion, just present. This isn't just about my land, she said. No, he said. It's not. He filed a fraudulent lien. He has a documented pattern of manufacturing financial pressure. He used his position on the bank's advisory board to accelerate my mortgage. She looked at the documents. This is a territorial matter, not just a local one. Yes, Samuel said. I need a lawyer, she said. Not Pine Hollow, Denver. I know a man, Samuel said. She looked at him. From my scouting years, he said. James Wren. He practices in Denver now. He handled land disputes for the Army Contracts Federal Jurisdiction Territorial Recorder's Office, mineral rights. He knows this specific type of case. A pause. He also has a long memory for men who manufacture debt to acquire land. He lost a client to it once. He takes it personally. Can you reach him today? I can write the letter this morning. If we send it on the noon stage, it reaches Denver by tomorrow evening. She stood up. Write it, she said. He was already moving back to the kitchen. Thomas appeared from the direction of the back room. He had been with their mother, apparently listening through the wall with the particular focused attention of a boy who had developed an expertise in understanding situations through the sounds they produced. He looked at the documents in Elizabeth's hand. Is it bad? He said. It's complicated, she said. But we have what we need. Samuel found it. We found it together. Thomas absorbed this with a nod that contained. Elizabeth thought more satisfaction than he was permitting himself to show. Good, he said simply, and went to put the kettle on because he understood with the practical instincts of a boy who had been managing household logistics since he was 11 that the next several hours were going to require a great deal of coffee. The letter went out on the noon stage. James Wren's response arrived in 3 days, which was faster than she had expected, and told her something about the nature of his interest in the case. He wrote that the fraudulent lion filing alone was actionable under territorial law. He wrote that the pattern documented in her father's papers, combined with the deed transfer records and the bank advisory board maneuver, constituted a case for a formal inquiry by the Territorial Land Office. He wrote that he could be in Pine Hollow within the week. He also wrote, Samuel Hayes is one of the most reliable men I have ever worked with. If he says the documents are legitimate, they are legitimate. And if he says you are worth fighting for, I believe him without reservation. She read that last line to Samuel at the kitchen table. He looked at the letter for a moment. Then he said, James is generous. He says you're reliable. I try to be. He says if you say I'm worth fighting for, he believes you without reservation. She looked at him. Did you tell him that in your letter? A pause. Not an evasive one. The pause of a man deciding whether the honest answer is the right answer, and concluding that with this woman, it always is. Yes, he said. She looked at him. It's true, he said simply. Thomas at the far end of the table turned a page in his schoolbook with elaborate concentration. James Wren arrived on Tuesday, which gave Caldwell 5 days to feel the ground he had tried to destabilize slowly stabilizing beneath someone else's feet. Elizabeth didn't know what Caldwell did with those 5 days. She imagined him making calls, visiting the right offices, applying the particular brand of preemptive management he used on situations he saw developing against him. Whatever he did, it wasn't enough. Wren was 60 years old and small and precise, and had the particular quality of a man who had spent 40 years in legal practice in the American West and had learned to measure every situation in exactly the terms it deserved. Not more, not less. Never inflated, never minimized. He shook Elizabeth's hand when he arrived and looked at her with the direct assessing gaze of someone who had formed a preliminary opinion and was checking it against the evidence. He apparently found the evidence satisfactory. He spent 3 hours with the documents. He asked Elizabeth questions, specific technical questions about timing and documentation, and her father's record-keeping practices, and he listened to her answers with the focused attention of a man building a legal architecture in real time. Then he asked to see Samuel. They talked for an hour in the study. The door closed. Elizabeth sat in the kitchen with Thomas and resisted the impulse to stand near the door. When Wren came out, he said, "The fraudulent lien is the simplest piece. We file a response with the Territorial Recorder's Office, documenting the absence of the alleged debt in 30 years of meticulous records. That piece collapses in a week, probably less." He sat down at the kitchen table. The larger case, the pattern of manufactured pressure, the Holloway and Pratt and Sutter acquisitions, the Bank Advisory Board position, that takes longer. But the Territorial Land Office has jurisdiction, and the evidence is strong. He paused. "I won't promise a specific outcome. I will tell you the case is solid." Elizabeth thought about the Holloway children, now adults somewhere, about her 8-year-old self watching them leave in the spring and being told it was because the land wasn't working for them. "Good," she said. "There's one more thing," Wren said. He looked at Samuel, who was standing near the window. "The Territorial Land Office inquiry will be public. Caldwell will know it's coming within a day of our filing. He may attempt to move assets or influence the